Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Redditors who have worked around death or burial, what's your best ghost story? Story 1. The Ghost Doctor of the Surgery Wing.
I used to work as a security guard at a hospital, a job that, while mostly routine, came with its share of eerie encounters and strange stories. But there is one night that has stayed with me, a moment that blurred the line between the natural and the unexplained. It was a quiet evening, and I was making my rounds through the hospital as usual. The night shifts were often uneventful, just long, silent walks through the empty halls, ensuring everything was in order. Around midnight, I found myself in the surgery wing, a place that typically buzzed with activity during the day but was now eerily still. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the soft echoes of my footsteps were the only sounds accompanying me as I walked down the corridor. As I turned a corner, I noticed a figure standing in front of the large whiteboard where all the scheduled surgeries for the day were written. It was a doctor, or at least it appeared to be. He was dressed in scrubs, with a white coat draped over his shoulders. He stood there motionless, his back to me, staring intently at the board, as though studying the list. Not wanting to be rude, I greeted him. "Hello, doctor," I said, my voice breaking the silence of the hallway. He did not respond. He did not even turn to acknowledge me. He just continued staring at the whiteboard as though lost in thought. His stillness struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. People can be preoccupied, especially in a hospital setting where life and death decisions are a part of the job. I carried on with my rounds, the brief interaction quickly slipping from my mind. Later that night, I returned to the security office. One of my colleagues, a veteran who had been working there for years, was sitting at the desk sipping coffee. I casually mentioned my encounter to him. "Hey, I think I saw one of the doctors in the surgery wing earlier," I said. I said hello, but he did not say anything back. Kind of rude, right? "Is that the guy you told me to watch out for?" He looked up at me with a curious smirk. "Where did you see him?" he asked. "In the surgery wing, right by the whiteboard," I replied, thinking nothing of it. At this, his smirk grew wider, but his eyes held something more, a flicker of unease. He set his coffee down and leaned back in his... "You are new, so I guess no one told you yet," he began. "The surgery wing closes at 9 p.m. All the patients get moved to the monitoring wards after that. There should not have been anyone there." A chill ran down my spine as I processed his words. But I saw him. He was there. I insisted, feeling a knot forming. My colleague raised an eyebrow. Was he looking at the whiteboard? I nodded. He exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, lowering his voice, as though what he was about to say was not meant for anyone else. "You met Dr. Luisetti," he said simply. "Who?" I asked, confused. He explained that years ago, one of the hospital's surgeons, a brilliant but troubled man named Dr. Luisetti, had taken his own life. For reasons no one fully understood, he had gone up to the hospital's helipad one evening, and the tragedy sent shockwaves through the staff, leaving an indelible mark on those who worked there. Even after his death, there were reports of people seeing him in the surgery wing, always at night, always standing in front of the whiteboard as though still reviewing the next day's surgeries. "They say he never stopped working," my colleague added with a faint, uneasy smile. "Looks like you just joined the club of people who have seen him." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as his words sank in. I tried to rationalize what I had seen, but no matter how I turned it over in my mind, I could not come up with a logical explanation. That night, every creak and shadow in the hospital seemed to take on a life. Even now, I can picture him, standing there in his scrubs, staring at the whiteboard as though his work was far from done. Whether it was a trick of the mind, a figment of my imagination, or something beyond comprehension, I will never forget that encounter with Dr. Lucidity. Some say hospitals are places of healing, but they are also places where life and death intersect. And sometimes it seems the line between the two is not as clear as we think.
Story 2. Echoes of the Operating Room.
Working the night shift as a junior doctor can be grueling, especially when you are called for tasks that carry a certain emotional weight. This particular shift was no exception. Around 2 a.m., I was paged. It was not my first time doing so, but there is always something somber about entering a room to confirm that a life has ended. I made my way to the private bay where the patient had been placed. The ward was quiet, save for the occasional distant sound of machines beeping and the muffled chatter of nurses at their station. As I entered the bay, the atmosphere immediately felt heavy. The room was dimly lit, the overhead light casting long shadows, giving the space a slightly gloomy and eerie quality. There he was, an elderly gentleman lying peacefully in the bed. His face was calm, almost serene, as though he had simply drifted off to sleep. A part of me felt grateful that, at the very least, it appeared he had passed peacefully. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the task ahead. Following protocol, I began my checks. First, the stethoscope. No signs of respiration, no heart sounds. I rubbed the sternum firmly, a test to elicit any response. Nothing. So far, everything aligned with what I was there to confirm. The next step was to check for any signs of brain activity. To do this, I needed to assess his cranial nerve responses, beginning with his pupils. I leaned in closer, reaching out to lift his eyelids. The room was so quiet that I could hear the faint rustle of my coat as I adjusted my position. My pen torch was ready in my hand, its small beam of light poised to do its job. As I leaned in further, something unexpected happened. The patient suddenly lurched forward, his face coming inches from mine. His previously peaceful expression was now so close, I could see every detail of his. I froze for a fraction of a second before letting out a scream that echoed through the room. It felt like time had slowed down. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. Was he alive? Had I made some terrible mistake in my checks? I stumbled back, nearly dropping my pen torch, my mind flooded with panic. Within moments, the door burst open and nurses rushed in. Their concerned faces quickly turned to alarm as they saw me standing there, pale as a sheet. What happened? What was that noise? One of them asked, scanning the room. You look like you have seen a ghost. Still shaking, I tried to collect myself, pointing at the patient who had just moments arise from the dead. That is when it hit me. I glanced down at the bed and realized my leg had brushed against the bed controls, accidentally raising the head of the bed as I leaned in. The patient had not moved of his own accord. I stared at the nurses, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over me. One of them took a second to piece it together before bursting out laughing. The others quickly followed suit, their laughter filling the previously grim. You poor thing, one of them said, wiping tears from her eyes. You thought he had come back from the dead, did you not? Looks like you have just given yourself a fright for no reason, another chimed in, grinning. I think you need this cup of tea more than anyone. They did not stop laughing for the rest of the night, and I could not blame them. While I did feel thoroughly mortified, the humor of the situation was not lost on me. That night, I learned two things. Always be mindful of where your leg is in relation to bed controls, and sometimes the scariest moments turn out to be the funniest stories later.
Story 3. The Butterfly's Message.
My grandfather was extremely sick in the days leading up to his death. He had worked with asbestos for all of his working life and had developed an extremely debilitating condition as a result. In his final days, he could not speak, nor could he communicate in any way. In fact, he had not spoken for an entire month leading up to his passing. On the day of his death, something extraordinary happened. He looked at my mother and, to her shock, spoke for the first time in weeks. He said, "The angel is back." My mother was stunned. She asked him what he meant, and he replied, "The angel is back, and this time he wants me." My mother, trying to make sense of what he was saying, followed his gaze to the corner of the room where he was looking intently. There was nothing there. She turned back to him and said, "Dad, there's nobody there." He did not respond. Later that night, he passed away. That was 20 years ago. My mother has rarely spoken about it since. When I was old enough to understand, she shared the story with me just as she did with my brothers. However, my sister never had the chance to hear it. She passed away when she was just 7 years old, after battling a disease her entire life. In the days leading up to her death, she began speaking about a butterfly that would visit her. My brothers and I listened to her stories, thinking she had created an imaginary friend to cope with her struggles. One day, though, she sat up abruptly and announced, "The butterfly is back, and he wants me to follow him." I will never forget the look on my mother's face. She had made the difficult decision not to tell my sister that she was dying. My sister believed she was just going through another rough patch, but then my sister added, almost casually, "I am going to die, am I not?" That's what the butterfly said. "He told me I'm going to die." My mother could not hide the truth any longer. She admitted to my sister that yes, she was dying. My sister responded with a simple, "Oh, okay." Then she lay back down, and surrounded by my mother, my brothers, and me, she peacefully passed away as we all cuddled her in bed. I often think about those moments, about the angel my grandfather spoke of and the butterfly my sister described. I do not know what I believe about the afterlife, but I feel certain there must be some truth behind the legend of the Grim Reaper or some other guide who comes to lead us away when our time here is over. Otherwise, I have no way to explain what I experienced. These moments, as heart-wrenching as they were, have left me with the unshakable feeling that death is not an end, but rather a transition into something beyond our understanding.
Story 4. Trapped by the Dead.
It was supposed to be another routine mop-up after a fire. The flames had been extinguished, and the fire crews were sweeping through the charred remains of the building, making sure every ember was out and there were no hidden hotspots waiting to reignite. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burned wood, melted plastic, and smoke. The blackened walls loomed eerily in the weak glow of flashlights cutting through the gloom. My colleague was part of the team tasked with checking the integrity of the structure and ensuring it was safe to declare the fire fully out. Everyone knew the risk. Burned out buildings are dangerous, but finding the remains of victims is the hardest part. It's something every firefighter hopes to avoid, but has to. This time, he wasn't prepared. As he carefully stepped through the charred wreckage, his heavy boots crunching over debris, he suddenly felt something different underfoot. It wasn't the brittle crack of burned wood or the squish of soaked insulation. It was something softer, heavier. Before he could register what it was, his weight pressed down. He froze, the realization dawning on him like a punch to the gut. His flashlight beam darted down, and there it was. The corpse was badly burned, almost unrecognizable, its flesh blackened and brittle in places. His boot had gone straight into the chest cavity, through what little remained of the sternum. The ribs, weakened by the fire, had collapsed under the pressure, and now his foot. Panic set in as he tried to pull his foot free, but the ribs had latched onto his boot like a trap. Each tug made the body shift, and to his horror, the torso lifted slightly off the ground. The charred arm, stiffened in grotesque positions, flailed upward as though reaching for him. It was like a scene straight out of a horror movie. In the dim light, the blackened remains looked almost alive, like a zombie trying to claw its way back to life. He struggled, yanking his foot harder, but the corpse, each movement caused more crunching, cracking, and the smell of burned flesh mixed with the oppressive smoke made him gagged. By now his flashlight beam was jerking wildly as he threshed to free himself, illuminating the ghastly spectacle for anyone nearby. Another firefighter rounded the corner and saw the scene. My colleague, his boot lodged in the chest of a corpse, seemingly wrestling with the burned-out remain. It took several more tugs and some assistance to finally free his foot. When he stumbled back, the corpse slumped to the ground with a dull thud, lifeless once. The aftermath was rough, even though firefighters are trained to deal with the grim realities of their job. No amount of preparation can fully shield you from moments like he couldn't get the sensation out of his head. The crunch of the ribs, the flailing arms, the weight of the body pulling at his leg. It haunted him for weeks, even months. He eventually sought counseling, something that's thankfully encouraged in the fire service. The experience had left a deep impression, but with time, support, and therapy, he found a way to process it. Still, he'll never forget that day. In the quiet moments, when everything is still, he says, he can sometimes hear the crunch of ribs under his boot and see those burned arms reaching for him in the dark. Firefighting is about saving lives, but it's also about confronting death, sometimes in the most visceral and unexpected ways. This was one of those moments that none of us will ever forget.
Story 5. The Silent Stranger in the Mortuary.
I have several stories from when I worked as a mortuary transport technician. The job involved transporting the deceased from where they were to where they needed to go. Turns out, dead people can have a lot of appointments. One time though, I had an experience I've never forgotten. I was dropping someone off at the science donation place. This is when you donate your body to science, and they take it from there. So I wheeled in the deceased, unlocked the freezer, and did all the necessary procedures in there. I placed the body on the board, got the lift out, and placed it on the shelf. The interesting thing about the freezer was that most everything, once it's processed, was wrapped in this blue tape, and you could definitely tell what was inside: legs, hands, feet, etc. It was kind of interesting to me at the time. Anyway, shut the freezer and locked it back up and started wheeling the gurney back over to the garage door. The science drop-off and processing area was in the shape of a large, with the freezer off to the larger, longer portion. And then you turn the corner, and there's desks, filing cabinets. I nearly had a heart attack as I turned the corner and saw this guy just standing there, examining files in the file cabinet. He looked just like you or me, dressed in modern clothing. I stopped and said that he'd have to forgive me, but he almost gave me a heart attack. It didn't look like he heard me at all or even knew I was there. I should mention this was also around 1 a.m. and I'd never seen anyone at the place this late. So I said, well, sorry if I startled you or anything, and went on and about finishing up my tasks. I got the gurney back in the van, closed and locked the large garage door from the inside. All the while this guy's just standing there, staring at an open file in front of him, not paying any attention to me. I had to use the bathroom, so I told him where I'd be going and that I'd be right back. Again, no response. I thought maybe he was deaf and couldn't hear me. So I went to the bathroom and came back to the garage, and the guy was gone, but the file cabinet was still open. I didn't know where he went, and I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hallway past the bathroom. I checked and made sure everything I was responsible for was still locked, and it was. So I just announced that I was going to be leaving and locking up to set the alarm. No response. That's exactly what I did, and then I left. I'm not sure who he was, or is, or what happened, but it was definitely an odd experience, and one I still remember perfectly. I have a few other memories about my time at the job if anyone else wants to hear. Nothing like what happened above, though.
Story 6. The body bag that haunts me.
It was just another typical day at the mortuary, but as soon as I got the call, I knew it would be anything but. I had been assigned to pick up a body from the local medical examiner's office. In this line of work, you get used to the routine of receiving a receipt when a body is released to you. The receipt lists the personal belongings of the deceased, watches, wallets, rings, or anything else they might have had on them when they passed away. It's part of the protocol, a simple job, but one that always comes with its own grim weight. That day, I headed to the medical examiner's office, prepared for whatever was to come. They handed me the body, and I got the usual receipt. As I loaded the body into my vehicle, a thought briefly crossed my mind. It was an ordinary task. Get the body, deliver it to the mortuary, double-check the belongings, nothing unusual. I arrived back at the mortuary, unloaded the body, and set it on the preparation table. The embalmer wasn't in yet, so I had a little time to get everything ready. As per my usual process, I opened the body bag to check the receipt against the deceased's belongings. I didn't expect what I saw. The man inside the body bag looked exactly like me. He was my age, had the same long hair, the same style of tattoos in the same spot, same jewelry, everything. It wasn't just similar, it was uncanny. His eyes were closed, his body still and lifeless, but everything about him looked as if he could have been my twin. For a moment I thought I might be losing my mind. I stood there frozen, staring at this man, trying to process what I was seeing. How could this happen? How was this possible? It was as if someone had pulled a mirror image out of my own reflection and placed it in front of me, cold and lifeless. I had never experienced anything like this. My heart started to race. I felt a knot form in my stomach. For the first time in my career, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of unease. I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just a coincidence. It felt like something deeper was at play, something that defied logic and reason. Just then, the embalmer walked in, unaware of what I was experiencing. "Hey, how's it?" He froze mid-sentence as his eyes landed on the body. "Holy moly, that guy looks like you." His reaction was the same as mine, stunned and a bit unnerved. We both stood there for a long moment, the silence in the room thick with tension. The eeriness of the situation hung in the air. It was as if we had both stumbled upon some cosmic joke that no one else could understand. "Man, that's freaky," the embalmer said, finally breaking the silence. "You sure this isn't some weird family reunion?" I couldn't respond right away. My mind was still reeling. The thought of the body lying there, so similar to me, didn't sit well with me. I tried to shake it off, but it lingered. There was something so surreal about it that I couldn't let it go. It wasn't just the shock of the physical resemblance that disturbed me, it was the feeling that something was off. This wasn't just about looking like someone else. It felt like the universe was messing with me, testing the limits of what was possible. That night I couldn't help but wonder, what were the odds of this happening? And more importantly, why did it happen to me? I wish I could say the experience faded with time, but it didn't. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about that man's face, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt a strange sense of dread. I would wake up in cold sweats, my mind replaying the moment I saw that body, knowing that, in some twisted sense, it could have been me. I started having nightmares about it, dreams where I was the one in the body bag, lifeless and still, and someone was standing over me, checking my personal belongings. I could feel myself being examined, my body cold and unmoving, as if I had somehow become part of the grim routine I had spent my life working within. There were nights when I would wake up, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the feeling that I was trapped in some sort of cosmic loop. It was as if I had been given a glimpse into something beyond the realm of explanation, a strange and unsettling premonition of my own mortality. As time went on, the nightmares didn't stop. Every time I picked up a body or went through the routine of checking the deceased's belongings, I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine. I wondered if that man was somehow a warning, something to make me aware of the fragility of life, or maybe it was just the mind playing tricks on me. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that one day I'd be the one in the body bag, and someone would be staring down at my lifeless face, wondering who I was and why I looked so familiar. That experience will stay with me forever, a reminder of how close we all are to the other side, and how the smallest, most unlikely events can shape our perceptions of life and death. I've been through hundreds of bodies in my career, but none of them ever made me feel as unsettled as that one. It was the only case I've ever had nightmares about, and it continues to haunt me every time I close my eyes.
Story 7. The day I felt a dead woman's grip.
It was only my second week in mortuary school, and I was still trying to adjust to the emotional roller coaster that came with learning to handle the deceased. One night, after a long day of lectures and laboratory work, I had a dream that stuck with me like glue. I dreamt I was embalming my dad. It wasn't just that he was dead in my dream, he was still alive. The scene was so vivid, so real, that I could almost feel the coldness of the embalming fluid and the tension in my hands as I worked. My classmates were there too, standing around me, trying to keep things professional. They told me it was just tissue gas, something I had learned about in class, but I was in complete denial. I kept thinking, this can't be real. He's alive. I can feel it. They kept telling me to get myself together and that I was imagining things. But then, right as I was cutting into him, he gasped. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. Help me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't breathe for a second. This was my dad. I felt his desperation, and in my dream, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow made the wrong decision, like I was performing some terrible, irreversible act. I woke up drenched in sweat, my pulse still racing. I didn't know what to make of the dream. I tried to brush it off, but it lingered in my mind all day. I mentioned it to my classmates the next day when we were preparing for our second case. We had a good laugh about it, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the dream had some deeper significance. That day, we were working on an elderly lady who had passed away. She had been suffering from severe arthritis, which had left her body stiff and rigid. It was my first real encounter with rigor mortis, and it was more challenging than I had anticipated. As I was trying to break the rigor, something happened that I'll never forget. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but it was a moment that felt completely surreal. As I applied pressure to move it, her fingers suddenly clenched around mine. I could feel her hand tighten in a grip that seemed far too strong for someone who had been dead for hours. My heart skipped a beat. The sheer unnaturalness of it hit me all at once. For a moment, it felt like she wasn't dead at all, like she was holding on to me for dear life. It was the only time in my entire career where I truly felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of her cold, rigid hand holding mine sent a chill down my spine. I had to step away, collect myself, and take a deep breath. The dream of my dad came flooding back, and I couldn't help but draw a strange parallel between the two events. The thought of a dead body somehow still holding on to life, whether it was through gas, rigor, or just my overactive imagination, was enough to rattle me. I had to get myself together, but I couldn't help but wonder if there was some kind of lesson in there. In mortuary school, they teach you how to approach death clinically, how to keep a clear head and not let your emotions get the best of you. But sometimes, the reality of it hits you in ways you're not prepared for. Sometimes it feels all too real. That moment with the elderly lady stuck with me for a long time after that. Every time I dealt with rigor mortis after that, I couldn't shake the image of her hand clutching mine. And even though I never had another dream like the one about my dad, I started to wonder just how thin the line is between life and death. It's something I'll never truly understand, but it's an experience I'll carry with me forever, whether I want to or not.
Story 8. The Visitor in the Night.
It was a regular night shift at the nursing home, and I was just going about my routine. It was around 1 a.m., and the place was quiet, as most of the residents were either asleep or resting. I was mopping the dining room floor, a space with large windows that looked out into the garden. The night was dark, pitch black outside, and the soft lighting inside cast long shadows, giving the whole room an eerie atmosphere. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You know that sensation when you just feel like you're being watched? I had it. It was almost suffocating, and it made my skin crawl. I couldn't pinpoint why, but the feeling was intense, like a weight pressing on my chest. I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me from exhaustion. But then I glanced up at the window. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. In the reflection of the window, I saw a man standing behind me. At first I thought it was someone from the night shift or maybe a resident who had wandered out of their room, but the figure was so out of place that my heart skipped a beat. He was wearing a brown suit and a bowler hat, an old-fashioned look that made him stand out in this modern-day nursing home. But it wasn't just the way he was dressed that unnerved me. It was his face. He had a cruel grin that stretched far too wide, almost unnatural. His mouth seemed too big, like it couldn't possibly fit on his face, and there was something deeply unsettling about the way he looked. The expression on his face was pure malice. It wasn't a smile, not even a smirk. It was a twisted, almost demonic grin, the kind of smile you'd expect to see on a villain in a horror movie. And in that instant, I froze. My entire body was rigid with fear, and I couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. In the fraction of a second it took for me to turn around and face the room, the man was gone. There was no one behind me, just the empty dining area with no trace of the figure that had been reflected in the window. My heart was racing in my chest, and my hands were trembling as I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. I was utterly alone, and yet I had just seen something or someone that made no sense. The next morning I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't get the image of that man's face out of my head. His grin, the look of pure evil, haunted me every time I closed my eyes. I started paying more attention to the residents after that, especially the ones who had mentioned seeing strange figures in their rooms at night. They had complained before about a man visiting them, standing by their beds, watching them in the dark. But hallucinations are common in the elderly, so their complaints were usually dismissed. However, after what I had seen, I started to listen more closely. To my surprise, it turned out that many of the residents had seen the same man, the one with the brown suit, the bowler hat, and the monstrous grin. They described him the same way I had seen him, standing quietly in their rooms, watching them with an air of malicious intent. Some said he would disappear when they blinked, while others claimed he would just fade into the darkness. But the feeling of terror he left behind was the same. It seemed he enjoyed terrorizing the residents, making their nights miserable. He was a silent presence, just watching them with that same cruel grin, never speaking, never explaining why he was there. And as much as the nursing home staff tried to chalk it up to the elderly simply imagining things, I couldn't help but feel that something more sinister was at play. I've worked in healthcare for a long time, and I've seen all kinds of things that can't easily be explained, but nothing like this. The image of that man in the window, his twisted grin, and the malevolence in his eyes stays with me to this day. I don't know who he was or why he seemed to take such pleasure in scaring people, but I learned quickly not to dismiss the experiences of the resident. There are things in this world that can't be explained away with science or reason, and sometimes the fear is all too real.
Story 9. The Ghost Who Played with the Lights.
It was during my apprenticeship at the funeral home when I first heard the rumors. The place had been around for decades, and like many old buildings with a history, people whispered that it was haunted. Specifically, they said it was haunted by the ghost of an old funeral director's assistant named John, who had suffered a heart attack in the building and passed away many years ago. At first, I thought it was just another one of those ghost stories that people love to tell, especially in a place as old as a funeral home. I had heard all the classic tales before: strange noises, cold spot, flickering lights. But this one seemed different because, well, it wasn't just a story. I had only been there a few days before I started experiencing things myself. It started with the chapel light. I would be in there getting the place ready for a service, and out of nowhere, the lights would flicker or completely go out. At first, I just assumed it was some wiring issue or a malfunctioning light bulb, but then it started happening more often, right when the family was about to arrive, or right after we had finished setting everything up. It was always the same. The lights would go haywire, causing a frustrating delay. One evening, after a particularly bad instance where the lights flickered on and off for nearly 10 minutes, I overheard one of the senior staff members telling a new apprentice about John. He explained that John was the assistant who had worked at the funeral home years ago. He had been a bit of a character, always a little offbeat but reliable. However, when he had his heart attack, he collapsed in the chapel. They said he died right there. And now, if the chapel lights went out, it was his way of making his presence known. I didn't really know how to respond. Was I supposed to believe that the ghost of a man who had passed away decades ago was still lingering around, flickering the lights to get attention? I had my doubts, but I wasn't about to dismiss it entirely. A few days later, the lights started flickering again, just as I was setting up for a family service. This time, instead of silently cursing the faulty wiring, I decided to play along. I said aloud, "John, the family is coming in soon. Please don't start messing with the lights." I half laughed at myself for even saying it, but to my surprise, the lights stopped flickering almost immediately. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was just coincidence or if something more was at play. But as the days went on, I began to notice a pattern. Every time the lights flickered, if I said those words, they would return to normal. It was like John was listening, like he was there, and something about acknowledging his presence made the problem stop. At first I thought I was just getting lucky, but this continued to happen throughout my apprenticeship. Every time the lights went haywire, I would casually call out to John, "John, the family's almost here. Please don't," and like clockwork, the lights would settle down. It didn't always feel comforting. There was something unnerving about the way it worked, like I was somehow appeasing an unseen presence. But it also felt oddly respectful, like I was keeping up some old tradition of acknowledging the spirit that still roamed the building. By the end of my apprenticeship, I wasn't sure if I truly believed the place was haunted, or if it was just a strange coincidence that I was able to calm the lights by calling out to John. But I kept doing it. I did it out of respect, out of a weird sense of duty that I couldn't explain. It became part of the routine. Whether or not John was actually there, I'll never know, but I could never bring myself to ignore it. And to this day, I still find myself whispering those words in the back of my mind whenever I enter a space where something feels off. I have worked in a few other places since then, but I have never had quite the same experience again. That funeral home, with its old walls and strange energy, will always have a piece of my memory. It wasn't just the building that was haunted. It was the strange little ritual we all fell into, trying to make sense of something that may never fully be explained.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.